I'd like to introduce my friend Sigal Alon, who is a professor of sociology at Department of Sociology, and at Tel Aviv. Because of shortage of time, I won't read the whole bio, but you can find it in the booklet.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's a difficult time here, and we'll probably all be more comfortable being someplace else, but I'm gonna shift the gear a little bit from the talks we heard so far. So I hope this will keep you awake.
Microphone.
I hope this will keep you awake, but if you have to sleep, please do this with your eyes wide open. So when we study social and economic mobility, we typically focus on the individual's outcome, like earnings and education, and I written to myself, give example from the conference, but I don't have to because we heard it all day long. And so we focus on these outcomes throughout their lifetime or between generations. And such as a portrayal is extremely useful for capturing differences between groups in their mobility chances. Yet, we typically do not dwell on how the choices of the individual agent are intertwined in this process. Yet people make choices every day, both trivial and consequential, that involve decision making among multiple alternatives. The choice of field of study in college may be one of the most influential in determining the individual life course trajectory. And in parentheses, I would say, of course, this is because the expansion of higher education, the importance of college major became even more important today than, let's say, 2 or 3 decades ago. Recent evidence should suggest that a field of study is the most important determinant of future earning, even after controlling for ability. Moreover, research suggests that much of the inequality in starting salaries between university graduates across gender and racial and ethnic lines can be attributed to differences in the type of degree they obtained in college. Consequently, field of study choices has the potential to be one of the most significant determinants of both intra and intergenerational mobility, and one of the factors perpetuating inequality. Despite its potentially critical implications, however, we still know very little about the actual decision-making process that produces young people's fields of study choices. So, responding to Yoram's comments, I'm going to talk today about what people are thinking when they go to college and need to choose fields of study. Classical choice models, either rational choice or heuristic choice models, place the individuals at the center of the decision-making process. Choices are seen as individualistic, based on the decision maker's academic or vocational abilities, utilities, taste, personality, perception, and biases, if I mix both theories together. Decision makers then consider their own preferences, and hence group-based variation in decision making, although it is acknowledged in both strands of theory, it's not well conceptualized. Yet, We may expect to find systematic differences in choices between groups because interests and ambitions are shaped by social identity, by socioeconomic and educational resources, and by the structure of opportunity. Oxby and Avery, for example, find that the vast majority of high-achieving high school graduates from low-income households do not apply to selective colleges in the US. While Muledan and Shafir demonstrate how the stress of scarcity distort decision-making. I argue, or I should say hypothesize, that choices of individuals that share similar constraints have acquired similar social identities and are part of the same social networks follows some kind of collective logic, defined for the purpose of the current inquiry as a set of guidelines that shape the decision-making of individuals based on group affiliation. The individualistic and the collective logics are, of course, complementary. Yet, while the individualistic component has been extensively studied either by economists or psychologists, there is less evidence as to how social identity shapes the educational choices. And I'm putting an emphasis on how, and I'm not asking whether. I mean, whether is going to be the first question, but what really interests me is how, and how these differences are materialized. So if indeed the vast majority of group members, say females versus males, poor versus rich, make similar choices, we need to conceptualize, explain, and document this structural element and its effect on the chances for socioeconomic mobility. So the key questions that we should ask ourselves or orient our research towards answering is first, are there systematic differences? This is the whether question. Are there systematic differences between individuals' field of study choices? For example, is the set of field considered by applicants from underprivileged background different from that considered by their more affluent counterparts? Do these differences exist net of academic preparation? The second question, which for me is the most challenging and stimulating, is to try and to understand, does the collective logic operates in guiding choices? Specifically, are there systematic differences between individuals in the operation of specific decision-making rules? And finally, since we gather here to talk about social and economic mobility, I want to link these differences, this variation between groups in choices to their academic and economic outcomes, and look at the implication for future socioeconomic mobility, and what does it can tell us, what are the implications for the reduction of inequality. So I'm going to, in my talk today, I would like then to crystallize our thinking about how we should orient our research to reveal the role played by the individual choices in the fanning out of life trajectories. And I'll illustrate with findings from several recent projects. One is still in progress, that shed light on group-based variation in college major set. Before we delve into the findings, I would like to outline some of the methodological difficulties in studying the variation in fields of study choices. And I'm saying this because the results I'm going to show to you today may seem simple and straightforward, but I must admit that this topic is one of the most challenging issues that I have encountered so far. So the main reason for the dearth of evidence on educational choices is the lack of data about revealed choices. This type of data includes the full array of alternatives from which the individual can actually choose from, and provide information on the chosen options and the ranking. We cannot obtain data on revealed fields of study choices in late specialization system like the US and Canada because college applicants apply to colleges and university, not to fields of studies. As a result, studies in these countries focus on stated preferences. That is, data derived from interviews within the individuals about their preferences, or data derived from administrative records regarding the position of individuals as a result of their decision. That is, already focusing on the outcome or the destination. This type of data cannot approximate the context in which actual choices are made, as they confound individual preferences with social desirability and real-life constraints. Yet, in early specialization system, like Israel, where college applicants are asked to list and rank their fields of study preferences at the application stage, applicants' preferences and choices can be directly observed. I just want to emphasize that I think that the issue of fields of study choices is important in every country, including the US and Canada, but the fact that we cannot actually measure these preferences directly is a problem, but we have to look in other countries that we can still obtain this type of data. So I capitalize on the unique admission process in Israel and exploited the administrative data that was obtained directly from the four most selective universities in Israel: Tel Aviv University, the Hebrew University, the Technion, and Ben Gurion University. This data set, which was constructed with the support of the Spencer Foundation, contains application information, admission decision, and student transcript. The dataset cover cohorts who applied to these schools between 1998 and 2008, and during this period, the four universities received applications from about 350,000 applicants. Building such a dataset of revealed choices requires converting the data to a person alternative rank configuration. We also need to accommodate the choices for dual majors. I just want to explain to our guest here that in Israel, for example, in Tel Aviv University, each applicant can list up to four choices, field of study choices, but each choice can be dual major. So what we get is a file that for each person we have 8 choices. And in the data we also want to accommodate for whether it's the first choice, the second choice, the third choice, and the fourth choice, and etc. In addition, we need to include the characteristics of the chooser and the characteristics of the alternatives. To give an example of how big the data can get, in Alon and the paper Tom and I wrote together, we analyzed the choice set of about 27,000 applicants to the Technion. And when we eventually we analyzed a person alternative rank file that contained 1.5 million observations. And the Technion is a small institution with only 26 fields of study. At Tel Aviv University, for example, we have 48 fields of study. So you can see how big this big data can get. And this can sometimes make it burdensome to compute choice probability for every person alternative rank observations. So possible solutions, and I'm not going to talk about it not to expand on it, but possible solution can include random sampling from the alternative rank observations within each respondents, or nesting some of the analysis, for example, by institution, or by the rank of the preferences, or by year, or by something else. Finally, another challenge in studying stratification in field of study choice set is how to make sense of the huge variety of fields. And this issue kind of mimics or trail the discussion we had previously, how to make sense of a huge variety of occupations and education level, etc. So altogether, in the data set that I'm working on, again, data from the 4 universities in Israel, there were 164 departments, and they're representing approximately 13 disciplines or 50 general fields of study. Typically, fields of study are classified into a handful of disciplines, for example, social sciences versus STEM fields. But such a sketchy classification captures neither the hierarchy of these categories nor the heterogeneity within this large group. So in my research, I used several possible metrics for quantifying group variation in fields of study choices. Among them are several fields characteristics like academic rigor, expected salary, graduation rate, the share of group in the field, for example, the share of females or the share of Arabs, and these are examples that I'm going to give you today. I also classified field of study choices by the relations between the attributes of the chooser and the characteristics of the field, and again, I'm going to talk about it later in my talk. So let's look at some finding. In Alon and Diprit, we study STEM-bound applicants to the Technion and to Tel Aviv University, and we examine the decision-making process that causes women and men to end up in different fields. Since we wanted to assess individuals, whether individuals use different utility weights in each of their rank choices, we fit a rank order logic model instead of the typical McFadden discrete choice model. So we find that men apply to exceptionally competitive majors relative to their female counterparts. That is, men take more risk in making choices, field of study choices. Women prefer female-dominated fields, and men, more than women, seek fields that increase the perspective of a lucrative job. Yet we show that applicants do not use similar utility weights across all rank options. In particular, the differences between men and women in their decision-making rules were more prominent in the first choice, while we find almost no difference in decision-making rule in the second choice. So as a result, the sex segregation in fields of study choices is higher in the first choices than in the second and other choices. Obviously, these differences in choice set lead to occupational sex segregation in the labor market with long-lasting economic consequences, but we didn't measure these mobility trajectories directly. In this paper, also published in 2015, I tried to track the variation in field of study among a different ethnic group in Israel from application stage through graduation, and quantifies the economic implications of this process in terms of the fields of study expected salary. the study shows extensive and ethnic variation in fields of study choices. So I think it's quite obvious that for the answer to the first question, are there systematic differences? The answer from these studies and from the third that I'm going to show you today is yes, there are systematic differences in decision-making process. In this paper, I focus only on Jews. In the third paper I'm going to show you, it's going to be Arabs. So the answer is yes, among Jews and between Jews and Arabs. One of the interesting findings in this paper, which orientation was a little bit different than just studying the choice set, but still is that there are ethnic differences regarding the match between applicants' economic aspirations on the one hand and the academic requirements of the fields that they listed on the other. Take, for example, just one example, the choices of immigrants from the former Soviet Union. They apply to majors associated with high salaries, but these majors required academic scores that are generally higher than the group's academic preparation. These patterns of economic aspirations that exceed qualifications is also found among high-achieving applicants from traditionally weak group, for example, second and third generation Mizrahi applicants. Mizrahi is those, I don't know if you heard it, I don't think so. Right. So in contrast, the economic aspirations of veteran Ashkenazi applicants tend to match their academic qualifications, so they know what they're doing. In other words, fields of study matching measured in this way is a marker of socioeconomic advantage. Again, I didn't directly measure their labor market outcomes, although I tracked their fields of study choices towards graduation, and I also looked at how lucrative or the economic, the starting salaries of the majors that graduated from, and I can tell you that ethnic based economic inequality in fields of study choices can explain some of the differences we find in the labor market between ethnic groups in terms of wages. So what I'm basically in the third paper is I'm capitalizing on all these insights, but I want to go a step forward and actually directly measures the academic outcomes of the variation in field of study choices. So Arab citizens are about 20% of the population, and they are at the bottom of the socioeconomic distribution. There are differences in educational attainment that are linked to the differences in the level, but also differences in the quality of the K-12 education system. And obviously all of these curb the chances that Arabs will acquire a bachelor degree. Indeed, Arabs are underrepresented among the recipients of degrees, diplomas from the Israeli university. One of the reasons for this gap in attainment is a gap in admission rate. My calculation, based on data from the 4 elite universities, reveals a stunning gap in admission rate. While 60% of the applications submitted to these institutions by Jewish applicants were accepted, only 34% of the applications submitted by Arabs received a positive decision. And as you can see here, this gap exists within every institution, and it exists within every year of the investigation and within every discipline. So this is quite a persistent gap. So, of course, it's possible that this gap in admission rate can be traced back to differences in K-12 academic preparation. But today I would like to entertain the hypothesis that maybe some of this gap can be traced back to differences in fields of study choices. So the results, these are just preliminary stage of this research, and the results are only pertains to Tel Aviv University. So in Tel Aviv, the share of Arabs in the period during the period of the investigation was 9%, but there is quite a steep growth within this short period, where the share of Arabs in the applicant pool rose from 5 to 11%. And we find a gap in admission rate. You can see here in all choices, when you consider all their ranked choices, we can find gap in the first choice, and again gap in every year and gap in every discipline. So there are differences in academic preparation between the groups. What we see here, this is the distribution of the academic composite score, which is the sole criteria for admission to the Israel University. It's a weighted mean of individual matriculation diploma and psychometric test scores. And this figure reveals that Jews on average have a higher entrance score than Arabs. So the question is whether these differences in academic preparation explain the gap in admission rate. The answer is not much. This is, I fitted a logistic regression to the admission decision, and the first model just included dummy for the group, coded as 1 for Arabs and 0 for Jews, while the second model controls for the academic score, and again, this is the sole criteria for admission. You can see that controlling for this academic score does not explain much of the variance between Arabs and Jews in admission rate.
Academic score is Bagrut only or Bagrut plus psychometric?
Both. Bagrut plus, this is the Sechem or Tzion Teken. Yet, another important difference that interests me more is the difference in the variation of the mix of preferred majors. Compared to the Jewish candidates, Arabs show very strong tendency towards medical and healthcare occupations, included medicine, but also nursing, occupational therapy and other health occupations. And they do so at the expense of technology and engineering fields, but also at the expense of social sciences and the humanities. So can we trace the gap in admission rate to this difference in the choice set? To do that, we need a more detailed classification of majors. So what we see here, the figure portrays the full array of fields by their admission rate and popularity among Arabs and Jews. So on the right side of each, on the right side of each figure, we have majors that are easy to get into, while on the left side of each figure, these are majors with low admission rate. What is interesting is that popular fields among Arabs are those with low admission rates. And this tendency is stronger among Arabs than among their Jewish counterparts. And of course, this is quite puzzling, given the fact that they have lower academic qualifications than the Jewish applicants. So the question I'm exploring is whether the difference in the match between the individual academic scores and the major academic threshold account for the huge gap in admission. So I'm using a measure for academic matching that was developed in Alon and Diprit. And this variable is basically the distance between the applicant's academic scores and the major academic thresholds in the previous year. So they are the same metric, of course, and so we just subtract one from the other. So I created this variable for Tel Aviv University, and I divided the outcomes into deciles. And so this figure represents the mean gap for each decile. On the left side, decile number 1, we observe the greatest negative individual major gap. So this gap suggests that individuals in these categories are underqualified for the major they have selected, and their choice is the most riskier than if they choose another majors. On the other side of spectrum, we have decile number 10, where the choices represent the least riskiest application choice and basically demonstrate over qualification. Category number 5 in the middle is where there is a smallest gap, or there is a match between the applicant's academic qualification and the academic threshold of the field. So I fit a rank ordered logic model where the dependent variable is the field of study choice set in the first and second choice. The choice model basically assesses the impact of the individual major match on the probability of applying to major J. So what they are together here, but I've done separate analysis for them, and there are some differences, but not so important that I'll devote part of my talk today, but yes. So what we see here is basically a chart of logic coefficients. How do you use it? What we see, you can see here that for Arabs, the modal category is category decile number 3, which is more riskier than the modal category for Jews, which is category number 4. You can see that how Arabs have a higher tendency to make riskier choices than Jews, and they have a lower tendency to go here to the route of overqualification. So they are less likely to apply to major that they are certainly going to be admitted to. And again, we see the same pattern, although to somewhat a smaller magnitude, but we see the same pattern in their second choice. So to assess the effect of these differences on academic matching, differences in academic matching on the admission chances, I created a matched per sample where I basically linked Arabs and Jews within each major in each year based on their academic composite scores, and then I render the admission logistic regression again to this within this matched per sample. So it's like running a separate regression for each major within each year, accounting for the test scores or academic scores. And the results are quite illuminating. You can see that running this regression within the match per samples, the gap in admission rate within between Arabs and Jews is much narrower from the results we've seen before, even when controlling for the academic scores. And then I fitted again the model for some of the disciplines, STEM, health, occupation, social sciences, and you can see the same patterns. In some of them, the point estimate is approaching 1, and the gap is not statistically significant. So this finding suggests that the difference in academic match of the choice set accounts for a substantial portion of the gap in admission rate between Arabs and Jews. And so the straightforward interpretation is that there are differences between the groups in terms of risk taking, pure and simple differences in personality trait. It's also possible that this behavioral variation capture other differences between the groups. For example, these differences in aspirations and ambitions. Arabs are up and rising groups in higher education. They're more likely to be the first generation in college and less likely to get advice from parents and teachers or counselors in school. As a result, they may have less knowledge about college major and labor market opportunities, and thus more influenced by peer effect and more easier to get influenced by herding behavior than Jews. Another possibility is that this variation is in risk-taking capture differences in the importance that Jews and Arab place on the link between college majors and the labor market. So employability and the expected salary of the field may be more important to Arabs than to their Jewish counterparts. And so in order to be admitted to a more lucrative field, Arabs may be willing to take more risks than are Jews. So while these explanations are not mutually exclusive, of course, and I'm not going to be able to directly test all of them, an effort to map several decision making rules can provide some clues about what's going on. So this is the last slide I'm going to show you. Just preliminary results here. It's just a preview of the field's popularity and expected salary. And as you can see, the tendency to choose a lucrative major seems to be quite similar in both groups. Although there is one important difference, is that Arabs' choice seems bimodal, where they, on one hand, they choose medicine or dentistry, which are majors with high expected salaries, but also they choose nursing and other health occupations, which are very popular among them, but they are much less lucrative. So this descriptive results suggest that the expected salary of the fields may not be the deriving force behind the differences between Arabs and Jews in choices, but of course further analysis is required for more conclusive results. So the next stage in this project will be to assess differences between the groups in the operation of these and others decision making rules.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Does this mean income for the group, or is it just the same? It looks like if I look at medicine or nurses, the income's the same for Arabs and the non-Arabs.
Right. Yeah. Actually, that's an excellent question, because in these two slides, yes, I use the same metric. I obtained data about the expected salary of the fields based on what was the salary of graduates when in these fields in the same institution when they enter the labor force in the first 2 years. Yeah. So that this I use this expected salary is the one that is expected by Jews. And there are differences. There are differences. The problem is that I cannot have the full chart using the Arab, the expected salary for Arabs, because they don't choose those some fields, and so there are no graduates in these fields, and there are no earnings to report to, and that I have a truncated variance in this field. So this is quite misleading, and of course I need to find a way how to combine the information that is specifically for Arabs in this entire framework, and this is why I said that these results are just preliminary, and I wouldn't build the entire story on them, but I thought that's interesting. So my last slide is just to tell you that we need to study fields of study choices or choices in general, because I think we need to include the individual agent and try to assess how people from different groups are making different decisions.
Could you show us the distribution of the psychometry balut that you showed before? I'm referring to.
Can you put the presentation?
Yeah. I'm referring to the right tail of that distribution, where there are no.
Yes.
That applies, the part of the distribution that applies to medicine, for example, is very interesting, because that's the slice where there is, if at all, an Arab advantage. And I wonder if you could speak to that issue. Where does the advantage come from? It begs a discussion. Because you've got a distribution that's so skewed to the left, or at least, you know what I'm referring to.
Right. So the Arab story is very complicated because it is bimodal. So we're basically talking about two different groups. We're talking about we have
הוא דולק, פשוט דבר.
So we have Arabs with high test scores, and they are applying to medicine and other fields with low admission rates. On the other hand, we have this tail of Arabs with subpar academic qualifications. So these guys are applying, most of them, to med school. I want to show you some kind of mind-blowing figure. These are the distributions of fields that by Arabs and Jews with psychometric. This is just psychometric score. Psychometric scores above 700, and the top is 800. It ranges between 400 and 800. So you can see that most of them, like almost 80% of them, apply to medicine. But these are exceptionally good students. They have no problem. They're in medicine. There is no gap in admission rate, by the way. But the problem is that not only these guys or girls apply to medicine. The problem is that those also with subpar academic qualifications, they also, all of them wants to be doctors, and also they applying to med schools and dentistry and pharmaceutical studies as well. So if you look at this is I took all the admits. Okay, these are admits to all the medical schools. This is for all the institutions, and I took their academic scores and created the class of admits. Okay, the first called it freshmen. Of those who were just admitted, I divided them into quartiles based on their academic scores, and you can see that actually actually the share of Arabs in the top quartile is they are overrepresented in the top quartiles. They are excellent students. On the other hand, if we look at what's happening at computer science, you see just the opposite. They are overrepresented at the bottom quartile. And for these guys are most annoying to me because they could go study computer science, but they choose to go to from. No, I don't think. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. את רוצה? צריכה לדבר קודם.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Sigal, for this excellent presentation. I liked it a lot. I'm not an expert on field of studies and not on decision making, but I enjoyed it a lot. I think you have here well, first of all, I think that it's very important to look at pre-market decision or critical points of decision making. Let's call it this way, because it affects later on whatever we do in the labor market, the career trajectories, and so on. And I'll come to this point a little bit later. It is so the importance of field of study is obvious, and I don't want to talk too much about this because it's crucial to understand the persistence of inequalities. We know it very well, at least I know it very well from the literature on gender inequality, and I'll relate some of my comments to this literature. But the main contribution that I see in this work is a theoretical contribution in the concept that you make on collective logic. I think it's a great concept. You try to explore here mechanisms that affect the choice of a group, and in particular, the most important argument that you make here is not only about the individual preferences and abilities, but this argument about social identities. So I see a very important contribution in this term, and I want to relate it to the studies on gender inequality. It's very popular now to attribute a lot of gender differences to another popular concept, gender essentialism. I personally don't like this concept, but I think that it does the same thing. It's your approach is put emphasis on a much broader social identities. You cannot talk about ethnic essentialism, I hope, and it's a little bit more complex and challenging than the issue of gender. So I think that there is a real contribution, contribution here. Now, how this collective logic develops, this is a very important question, and I think that merits more attention or further research projects. So now I will give you research plan for the next 20 years, if you want. So in the case of gender, for example, some of the explanation go back to early socialization or to biology even, but some of the explanations, at least the ones that I see here, go back to the labor market. You said that money, or at least the expected income, is not really important, but the employability might be more important. Arabs cannot get jobs in most sectors of the economy. We all know this argument of security. So the high tech might be close to the in other fields as well, while medicine and health, other paramedical occupations are mainly in the public sector. So it's very easy for them to get jobs or to be less discriminated against and so on. So it is important to understand how groups develop this logic, and in time, of course, it becomes also a cultural choice, and it gets hierarchies within the society and so on. So this is one way to take your concept. Now, regarding the choice, I have another suggestion for you. The choice set, well, you explained to us how difficult it was with one occupation. But if we think of the regular student in Israel, at least, they will apply to one university. They will apply to many universities, not only to one university, and to colleges as well. So each individual has thousands more alternatives, and I wonder if there is a way to trace the choice set of individuals, not of institutions. Instead, it's much more complicated, and probably you cannot do it very easily. But it could be an interesting way to go, because there might be a bias here. Tel Aviv University is very highly selective, and this is a question because it is possible that, for example, Arab students, I don't know if it applies to all groups in society, but in the case of Arabs who apply to Tel Aviv might be a selected group. And maybe most of the Arab applicants to other universities have very different choice sets. Or maybe different risk taking behavior than the ones who apply to Tel Aviv. It's possible that these students who apply to people who apply to Tel Aviv also apply to other universities and can get to these areas in other universities. For example, they can get into medicine in Ben Gurion University, but it is possible that they apply also to colleges and settle on something else, or go to study abroad, go to Jordan, yeah. And so it's, they might think, what do we have to lose? We apply to many universities, we apply to Tel Aviv too, maybe we'll get lucky and pass the Khatar. So it could be interesting to compare these students to less selective universities to understand if this could be generalized to the population at large. I'm sure that the fields of study will be similar, but as much as possible. But another point that I want to make is that while there is a very clear connection or relationship between the field of study and career trajectories, there are also variation here, and the variation are not might be also group dependent. So not all people who study at the university can find jobs in academic occupations, and I know at least from our studies, Efrat and my studies, that women, for example, many women don't find employment in academic occupations. We didn't know what they studied in university, but I can assume that they studied humanities or social sciences, and they ended up being in clerical jobs, mainly, at least more than 50% of them. Administrative, clerical jobs, even sales, not only very high prestige jobs. And also there is a lot of decision making that within the labor market. So in the case of women, again, they might decide on the job that they take. They might go, even if they study in a very lucrative area that the average wage is very high, they might go to the public sector because they then can combine work and family and so on, and have other calculations rational calculation or less rational calculations, but their career trajectories will be very different from one field to the other. So the field of study is important, but it doesn't tell the whole story, and it doesn't explain the entire inequality between groups in the labor market. I'll stop here? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Open the floor for questions.
I think this is sort of an excellent paper. And I just want to add that the problem that you put up, it's essentially the marriage market problem. It's a very well developed model. And the idea basically here is that there's a matching issue. The university wants you and you want the university, but there's not enough space. So the question is how you solve this problem. And there's a huge literature on this, interestingly mainly by Turks. So if you want some references how to do this kind of mathematics, I would be glad to help.
Thank you.
Actually, Yoram's comment fits well with my suggestion of something that you probably can't analyze, but you may want to take into consideration. I like the idea of this, the sort of non-individualistic, whether it's collective decision or heuristic for decision making. In interviews with Arab students or workers, one of the main things that comes up is that even their field of study is to a great extent a family decision, not an individual decision. And a lot of them I assume apply, in some cases I know, but I don't know, in large numbers whether it affects the statistics, is that they apply to medicine knowing that they will not get in, but it satisfies the family's choice that they should try for medicine. So in part it may be an issue of lack of information, but I think mostly it's going into areas where it's expected from them, and in order for them to get support from their families to study, say, sociology, for example, they first have to show that they couldn't get into medicine or to, some other one of these. So I think part of that gap has to do with the way decision making happens there, and say mostly in the Jewish, not maybe all the Jewish population.
I have two comments. And the first may show that I don't understand the Israeli system well enough. But it would be useful to calculate what the acceptance rate would be for the Arab students if they behaved in what we think of as an optimal fashion, or if they behaved similarly to what the non-Arab students do, as a way of trying to measure how their college enrollment would change or their field of study would change. Maybe you've done that. Then the second, which is probably an idea for a second paper, in economics there's now a growing literature which tries to use exogenous admissions to schools to look at the effect of going to more selective schools or majoring in certain fields. Magda Mogstad has done this kind of a setup looking at Norway, where there's a threshold and students apply to the major and they get in or they don't. And you look right around the margin, and your data seem pretty well set up to do that. And you may well find that there's a higher return for the Arab students if they were to get into their first choices. I don't know, maybe you wouldn't find that. But that would seem kind of a natural next thing to look at with the data that you have.
And just a final comment. I think this is an area ripe for an intervention that you could have some experiment on. And there is a literature in the US and the UK now of attempts to help choice in a different context. And I think eventually, once you have done more research, you could set up quite an interesting experiment. I mean, the politician earlier was saying, spend some money. I would say spend some money on some very focused experiments that might. You could use the 1 billion, but maybe you could but at a transition point like this, you could do something actually quite cost effective. And there's all sorts of nudges and more intensive interventions you could consider. But I think that's a bit further down the line, perhaps.
Sigal, I had a question about the matched analysis that you did. I mean, did I understand correctly that you were matching the Arab and Jewish students both on their major and on their scores?
Yes.
So was that 0.7 roughly coefficient, was that like pure discrimination?
Well,
Because if they only make the decision on the score and the score is the same and they're applying to the same major, why should there be any effect at all of being Arab?
So the score, this is an under specification because the score is not the same. I couldn't really match them within each major, within each year by the exact score. So I matched them by the deciles. So I took the scores and created deciles and I matched within a decile. So it's possible that, the Arabs are at the bottom of each decile and they do top of the decile. So that's one issue that I'm missing here. And I think that may explain quite a lot, but it's impossible to do this matching, that direct perfect matching.
You could down that, by moving the Arabs down a decile or up decile, to see if that can account for the whole difference.
And another, so I started to answer Tom, I didn't answer everybody else, but another difference is that there may be differences in their the type of matriculation courses that they have. For example, if they have the high intensity math. So this will come into calculation into the academic scores, but it's different departments. And we use, when we done the paper on STEM fields, they use different metric. And I couldn't use this different metric because it's only for STEM fields. So I could probably do a better analysis or for STEM fields or more aggregated sub-disciplines. But if I'm going to use the entire sample, then I have to give something.
I would like to give some support to Chaya's comment about the discrimination of Arabs in the job market, in the labor market, as one of the biggest explanations to that. I have a student who's doing, we don't have final results yet, but I can give some anecdotal evidence. I'm teaching the master course for macroeconomics in the Hebrew University for something like 25 years. And in the last 10 years, I have no Arab students, which means that there are no Arab students doing the master in economics. And even in the BA level, the only students I get now are those who study accounting, and they take some economic courses because they need to diversify something, but that's it. So, and this coincides with our knowledge that you cannot find, or you can find very few Arabs in the Bank of Israel, in the Ministry of Finance, and definitely in banking, top research departments and places which hire economists. So
it's not discrimination. What you're saying is that they just don't have this type of education that you need in the Bank of Israel.
No. These people are not hired, and as a result, that's the reason why they don't study it. Yes.
I wanted to maybe suggest you after you sorry, my English isn't that well. The difference that you found in the rate of admission, maybe some of it is because Arabs, when they try to get into college, they are much younger than Israelis, and they are just after their Bagrut, and sometimes they don't have all their scores yet, and sometimes they get into just the waiting list, and then they get admitted or not. So that might be a part of the explanation. And also I wanted to say about the nudges and policies that could be implemented, that there is a scholarship right now, well, 3 years now, called IRTICA, which tries to change and change the choices of the Arab population to those places that are not chosen right now, that are scarce.
I have to admit that I prepared for the wrong exam because I read a previous paper of yours relating to the Russians. And what impressed me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Russians have worse results in high school than the old veterans, than the veteran Jews, but they apply to the same degree to the STEM schools, and that's what explains the fast mobility in society. And so I found it very interesting in the sense that your aspirations can sometimes determine your mobility. And of course, the story of the Arabs is a converse of the story of the Russian Jews.
Okay, so I'm gonna make it quick, so I'm not gonna take much time from Tom. Regarding Haya comment about the fact that they are applying to other universities, so of course I'm gonna do the analysis for all the universities, all the selective universities. So I'm gonna have the entire universe of applicants, but I cannot distinguish. So I may have some students who apply to both, and I won't be able to distinguish them, even though it kind of duplicates. So I'm going to cover entire universe of elite universities in Israel. What I cannot do is include the colleges in this system. First of all, because the colleges do not have such a good data about choices of applicants, and anyway, I think it really expands the scopes beyond of what even I can do. So I know the limits of focusing only on the university and not on the entire universe of higher education. But within that, I think we can still crystallize some interesting insights. Regarding the marriage market, thank you. That's a great comment. But I just want to emphasize that what interests me is not just that there is a process of matching, but there are differences between groups in the process of matching. So a good literature for me would be that if there are differences in the marriage market between blacks and whites, for example, if this operates differently, the marriage market operates differently, that's what I'm looking for.
But it certainly varies between groups in Israel.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure. What I'm saying here, I mean, I'm studying field of study choices, but I really think about it more generally, and I think there are people who make choices in other realms of life, and probably some patterns are we can find in other in labor market decisions and in the childbearing decision, etc. Now, about the I'm going to answer you about the regression discontinuity, because I've used already regression discontinuity in different contexts, in the context of affirmative action. And there is maybe possible to use regression discontinuity here, but I have to think about their outcomes, their alternative outcome, because if they are rejected, I don't have data on what they're doing. So I need to keep them. But I can look at what their outcomes if they were admitted to a different major. That I can do, and this is what I've done when I study affirmative action policy, which we also have in Israel. Now, I want to say a couple of things about the decision-making process and the mechanisms and discrimination. So first age, I I didn't show you today, but there are models where I control for age, so this doesn't explain the differences in admission rate between Jews and Arabs. But I want to say that probably there are several explanations, and I'm not saying that I found the only explanation to differences in admission rate or to differences between Arabs and Jews in the labor markets and the socioeconomic mobility. I just think that we should shed some light on this specific critical decision-making point that we typically get unnoticed. Now, regarding what you said about family decision, I think this is actually what I'm trying to do. I think there is something that happens differently among Arabs families and among Jewish families, and the parents behave differently. And that's part why Arabs are making such a different choices. Of course, I have no doubt that Arabs are discriminated against in the labor market. But I wouldn't jump into conclusion to say that they are discriminated in computer science or high-tech jobs, because the figure that I show you, and I have another figure how their graduation rates look in different majors. So we're talking about different pools. The Arabs who are graduating from med schools are as good, if not better, than the Jewish students who are graduating from medical schools. But the Arabs who are graduating from computer science are not as good as their Jewish counterparts. And I think the employers can detect this difference. And so if a high-tech company doesn't hire an Arab who graduated, I know that when they graduate from college, they graduate at the bottom of their class in computer science, they graduate at the top of the class in, they have lower grades. I'm
I don't want to affect the friendship. You should know.
What I'm saying is that discrimination is always, we run a regression, and this is the unexplained component. Well, I think that this unexplained component is overrated, and of course Arabs are discriminated in the labor market. What I'm saying is that they may have, even if they have the same type of degree, they may be different or seems to be different students or workers in terms of their Jewish counterparts.